Hello and welcome to a new episode of That Fertile Feeling, the podcast. My name is Françoise and I'm a bit of a fangirl today because I'm here with Kay'aleya Hunnybee. I've listened to your podcast so many times that I can pronounce your name in one go. From the Wabanaki lands in Maine. You have your own show, the Herbal Womb Wisdom podcast, where you discuss all things herbs, feminine health or female health, the womb in particular. So I'm so happy that you're here today to talk to us about all of these topics. And my first question to you is, how did you become, that's what I call you, a herbal womb wisdom keeper?
I love that, actually. I like that term. Herbal Womb Wisdom Keeper. Oh my gosh, it's been quite a journey to get here. First of all, thank you for having me on. Thank you for
Mm,
inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
thank you.
And I love knowing that you have listened to the podcast so much. I think that's just really just knowing that there's like a depth of relationship that we've cultivated, even though we were speaking before we started recording,
Mm,
both having podcasts, that feeling of like we speak into the void a lot on our podcast, but knowing there are people who are really receiving and are cultivating a relationship with us over time. So I love that. And I think in some way, it's interesting that you asked the question of our herbal womb wisdom keeper, because for me, it has all come from a desire to cultivate more relationship, like starting from way back, 20 plus years ago when I was really oriented more towards the environment, the earth, like tending the earth. I was super interested. I graduated from college and I was like, wow, I have zero practical skills. I
mm,
know a lot about how to research
mhm,
and write papers and present things, but I do not have any idea about like how to grow my own food. Like I didn't grow up knowing that stuff. I grew up in the New York City area. I had no relationship, no connection to that. I mean, we had plants around, but I didn't have parents who were into anything natural health or anything like that. So
mm,
at the end of school, I was just like, wow, I have no practical skills. I need to at least know how to like grow some food or grow a plant. So I started just working on farms and work trading on farms, living in different communities. I was really interested in different ways of life and different ways of living because it didn't feel like the system we were living in made much sense. When I was at one of those communities, it's called Sandhill Farm in Missouri, which is middle of the United States, kind of very Midwestern hill country farmland. It was a commune that had been around since the 70s, and they had an extensive library.
mm,
And I found Ina May Gaskin's book, Spiritual Midwifery, there. Have you read that book?
yeah.
Yeah. That changed my entire perspective on everything that it meant to be in a body with a womb, to be a woman, to have the potential for birth. Like the concept, like that book, for anybody who hasn't read it, is so much around like this kind of cosmic relationship that we can have with our pregnancies, with our birth, especially with the birth time, how it can actually, for some people, even be pleasurable, how we really want to like, I just
Mm,
love the way that the words that she uses in that book too, which I don't know if they're appropriate for the podcast or not, but some of the ways that she talks about with like the partners coming in and just like, get sensual and get sexual and like really, get into your pleasure zone to be able to have this babe because what brought the babe in brings the babe out and just all of those
mm,
thoughts and ways of being was kind of like, oh my gosh. Like, first of all, I have no connection to like even this concept. I was like 22 years old, so I wasn't like thinking of having a child at the time. But I really was also like, I have no relationship to my body either. And seeing like there's like power and there's like pleasure and there's possibility in this place. That was a seed that was planted for me. So that was, over 20 years ago when I was at that commune. And I didn't immediately just start learning about wombs and getting into plant medicine. But over time, I was introduced to plants as medicine through a plant walk. That was the initial way that I got connected to plants. And I was like, what? These medicinal plants live outside, like right on this trail that I've been walking for months. Like I had no idea.
mm,
And I think that a lot of us, like previous to that, I had thought, oh, you have to grow the herbs. Like they're probably, you would have to cultivate them like you do with food,
mm,
the medicine that we're going to be using effectively. But truth be told, like no matter where you live on the planet, there is medicine that's living around you. And just getting to know some of the wild weeds and the plants that live around is powerful in itself. So that was like an initiation for me probably a year or two after I had read Spiritual Midwifery. So it was kind of like, I initially was like, oh, the womb is a place of power. There's something more to this than just physical. And then, wait, the plants that can heal us and support us live like right where we live? Like mind shattering, right? Like life changing experiences. They seem so simple, but they really brought in my perspective. And then, there's just such a long story to get to where I've been, but ended up in bodywork school because healing arts became something that I was really interested in. And while I was there, I worked with pregnant people. I was working with some pregnant women and mothers and learning perinatal care and especially subtle body work. And I was just like, wow, this is so beautiful. Like working with pregnant parents and feeling, especially at the subtle level, like the difference, because I had worked with the same modality. It was like a particular kind of similar to craniosacral, but a different core synchronism was what it was called. And I had worked with just normal adult humans before. And so when I actually put my hands on and was subtly sensing that babe inside, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is like the softest, most magic kind of energy I've ever experienced. I need to work more with this. So like from that moment, I was like, how do I work more with this energy? So I was immediately like, oh, I think I'm going to look into midwifery because of course I'd read, Ina Mead's book and I'm like, okay, I'm looking into midwifery, ended up doing birth work. So really it's been this gradual process. And that was 2008 was when I first trained as a doula and first started attending midwifery classes and studying midwifery. So I spent like 5 years of my life. I was learning herbs alongside that the whole time, but I was really oriented to learning physiology, womb care, a little bit about menstrual health and cycle tracking, but more from the lens of fertility. And then absolutely pregnancy, postpartum care, because that's what I was doing. And so I was doing body work and birth work and all of those pieces, and then bringing the herbs in alongside that I knew. But it was still in midwifery school, because at least in the United States, I was doing home birth midwifery. That's what I was studying. So because of that, a lot of what is accessible to home birth midwives is herbs. It's not like you don't necessarily aren't, it depends on the state, but most home birth midwives do not have access to a lot of different pharmaceuticals. And so because of that, you have to learn the herbs. And so I was learning the herbs from that lens. And so I really got a lot of sense around pregnancy, labor, especially herbal care. And then a little bit with postpartum, but honestly, that was lacking in that training a bit. I feel like that's been lacking in a lot of trainings over time. But yeah, over time, I think that depth of relationship that I cultivated with the power of the womb space, the power of the childbearing years, and just orienting myself to that, it all just started cultivating this foundation for me. And then, yeah, and then I ended up moving to a different state, and state by state, we have completely different laws here in the United States. So I moved from Vermont to California, and in Vermont, you don't have to go to a nationally accredited school to become a home birth midwife. In California, on the other hand, you do. And so the 3 years I had just spent devoting myself, like straight up devoting myself to this school, it no longer mattered. It was like I would have to start all over again. So I actually decided, okay, I'm going to take a break from this. I'm going to see if I feel like I want to walk the path of midwifery again and do it all over. It felt like I felt I had so much emotion in that time. Honestly, that was another time where it's like dissolving all the identity that I had cultivated for myself. But then I found Aviva Ram, and I realized that I could still focus on womb work, menstrual, reproductive, hormonal care, and be with women as a midwife is with women, but be with women because that's what I really cared about. And I could bring the plants in, and I could do that in kind of my own way. So actually, I've been honestly cultivating this path. It's not like I've had people in front of me who've been doing what I'm doing, or that I've just studied with people who it's a straight line. It's not. So one of the things I noticed, because I did a ton of herbal training over the years with different teachers, and including, grad school and various other programs, clinical programs and all kinds of programs. And one of the things that I noticed is that, gosh, like in all of those programs, there's very little that's taught about reproductive hormonal menstrual health. There's a lot of like symptom relief, but there's not that deeper level care. And so I had to piece that together myself.
Mm-hmm.
So honestly, it's been, yeah, that's a really long answer to be like, oh, it's been like almost 20 years of a journey to get here.
Mm.
And it's a journey I'm continuing on, but I feel like it really has come from a place of cultivating relationship with body, with earth, with this ancestral sense of this is who we are. Like this
Mm-hmm.
is who many of our womb lineage, like grandmothers, this is the knowledge they would have carried.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives me, yeah, I think that that is really like a deep inspirational place that I come from with it.
Mm. The word that comes to mind really is empowerment.
Mm.
There's so much power to be found in, like you said, the herbs that are just there growing in your garden, in your forest, wherever you are. The power, the information that's there in your body, and being able to connect to that and read it and know what to do with it. I'm reminded of, I think, one of like a really powerful episode that you have that might not be like really suitable for the listeners of this podcast is on herbal abortions, which was mind blowing to me because you talk, I can't remember who your guest was, but you discuss how, for an abortion, you can work with plants and there will be plants that help your cervix open. There will be plants that give you mild contractions. It also reminded me straight away of when you get pregnant, all of a sudden you're not allowed to eat cinnamon, right? Because we all know that these things do something, but we've sort of lost that connection to that power of herbs to really have an impact on your body, on your womb space as well. That's why I really wanted to talk to you today as well, to not talk about abortions, but the fertility side of things.
I love that. Yeah, that was Molly Dutton Kenny. That was Molly Dutton Kenny. She is a midwife, actually trained as a midwife, and she came to midwifery from the lens of abortion care, which is super interesting to hear her story. But one of the things that is interesting about that you even bring that up, is that all of those herbs, pretty much all of those herbs that we talk about, which
Mm,
are really most effective just right when or before you're expecting your bleed. It's like harder to work with that later on.
mm,
But honestly, pretty much all of those herbs are herbs that we talk about in midwifery. Like when I studied midwifery, we talked about those herbs both to support miscarriage release, like to support a more
mm,
complete miscarriage. So when you know that that's happening, and then also to help get a labor going.
mm,
So it's this knowledge, it's so interesting. It's like, oh, trying to separate. It's like, oh, this is abortion and this is birth. But
mm.
actually, they're more connected than I think
Yeah.
we think about. It's really just working with the womb and understanding how the body works, and the plants that we've had a relationship with for, yeah, forever pretty much. And because Western herbalism, which is a lot of what I've learned, I've also studied Ayurveda and Chinese medicine, and I love those too. And I really bring a lot of those in, but Western herbalism, in quotes, because it's a lot of places, but a lot of it is sourced from Europe, from European herbalism traditionally. So a lot of what we would work with here, there are a lot of overlaps with what you might find in Europe too,
Mm.
which I know where you are.
And can you tell us a little bit more about this connection between herbs and female health in general?
Oh gosh, that is such a huge question. I think, okay, just go listen to my podcast. But yeah, like I said, it's really, I think how I want to answer that question is that it is our ancestral birthright to work with herbs.
Mhm,
That our wombs, the way that we are connected through our womb spaces to the cycles of nature and to the cycles of the earth, so too, like, do we have that relationship with the cycles of the plants that are outside us and getting to know them? And we have just had that forever. And so I think for me, I don't think they go separate. I don't think they're separate.
mhm,
I think that plants, I mean, we've co-evolved with plants over the course of thousands of years, maybe millions of years, but certainly tens of thousands of years. And so our bodies know how to respond to them. And so when we're working with herbs in relation to female health, we're working with plants and essentially constituents, if you want to think about it more scientifically, that our bodies know, our bodies are familiar with. So I think there's so many ways that can look. There's so many ways that can look. It really depends on what somebody has going on, how they want to work with the plants. I would say just from a general base level, getting to know like seasonal lifestyle and working with herbs throughout the season that make sense, it's a really lovely way to explore working with plants. I think that overall, generally supporting our like in quotes female health, meaning like maybe menstrual hormonal health, really understanding how to support nourishing our tissues, really like working with more nutritive herbs. So herbs, nourishing infusions like with nettles or with oat straw, or with red raspberry, or with alfalfa, or possibly with hawthorn, depending on what we have going on and which herbs make sense for us, but really deeply nourishing our bodies from that lens is probably one of the things that almost everyone would benefit from and could really support us. But then there's many ways. I have 5 pillars of hormonal health from an herbal lens, and one of them is nourish and tone. So kind of coming from that perspective. Then there's detox and eliminate. So really learning how to work with herbs to help our liver function, our kidney function, our skin, just like moving stuff, excreting out of the body, digesting well. And then there's soften and moisten is one that I think is often totally overlooked. But essentially that because our world is so much about go, 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 push, intensity. And so we're always trying to like keep up. But that releasing, that art, cultivating the art of receptivity, that softening of our tissues. So many of us have pain, so many of us have tension. So how do we relax the tissues? How do we relax our bodies? So softening and moistening from that lens of both if it's dry, moistening it, but also if it's hard, softening it. That's really important. And especially when you think about our womb space, especially when you think about fertility. Fertility, it is huge. That's an area that I think, gosh, you go to like, you have like fertility treatments or something, somebody is deciding to do that, and then they're never kind of talked to about how to relax, how to cultivate like an energy of receptivity or softness. It's like, whoa, you're just trying to get it in there. It's like entirely the opposite of what our bodies want to do. So, and it's still forceful and sometimes works, but it's interesting. Okay, so soften and moisten. I have to think about these now. And okay, there's detox and eliminate, nourish and tone, soften and moisten. Reduce inflammation. That's a huge one. And all herbs are so good at all of these things. This is where I think herbs shine. There are so many herbs, almost all, honestly, herbs help to reduce inflammation in some way, but there are many that have even more affinity for reducing inflammation in the body. So that's huge. And then calm and ease is the other one. So calm and ease. So that from my mind is mind, spirit, emotion, and body, right? So like calming the mind, you've got anxiety, you've got all kinds of like hyper intensity, you're really high stress, what are all those things? So really working with the herbs to help to calm and then to ease from the place of easing whatever systems are kind of going haywire. And herbs are great for that. Herbs are not always the only answer. That's just also the truth, right? Like I think that's one of the things that I actually was thinking about like writing a post at some point that was like, herbs don't work. But the reason that I'm saying that, or that I would, or maybe even making a podcast episode about that, because it's like, it's not just herbs. Like a lot of the time, the herbs are helping to remind our bodies of something, but there's so much more to behavior change, to shifting our lifestyles, our nutrition, the food that we're eating, the environment we're in. Like you can't replace any of that with herbs. You can't be like, oh, I live in this environment where I'm drinking water that has lots of chemicals in it and I'm using plastic all of the time and I'm like, exposed to all kinds of environmental toxins. And so I'm just going to work on my liver and my detox. No, like, I mean, yes, you can do that. It'll help a little bit. But if you don't like plug up that hole, or at least try to reduce some of that exposure, you're just going to be like, they're just going to be pouring in. I think that's another thing. We're not quite talking about fertility yet, but we can. Like, it's another thing around the lens of fertility where I think that there is a lot of lack of awareness of how our environment, especially
Mm.
like toxins in our environment, can impact our bodies and their capacity and desire to reproduce, really. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
That went on and on.
Yeah, no, a thing that came to mind for me, I just recorded a whole series, like a different episode for each part of the cycle and
Mm.
what you can do during that part of your cycle to work on your fertility or work with your cycle while you're trying to conceive. Um, so this is a thought that came up now is that this is where herbs could actually work really nicely, is that because you're already, when you have that cycle awareness, you know, like maybe I'm now in my follicular phase. I'm there now. I'm not feeling super energetic, but usually you're energetic, you're trying to enjoy life. So I can imagine that you would be working with herbs then that support that feeling of joy, of aliveness. Um, and that could be a really easy way of integrating. Like you said, it's not this one solution, but I can really see that there's a connection between your cycle, the different phases, and using herbs for whatever it is that you need support with at that point, also during menstruation.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective to have and something to explore in oneself. I think from the lens of totally. I love the idea of like, oh, you're in your follicular phase, so you could maybe be working more with some phytoestrogenic plants or so really, alfalfa or shatavari or certain herbs to like kind of soften and moisten, right? To like work towards bringing up and supporting that ovulation and the cervical mucus being more
Mm,
abundant and estrogen rich essentially, so like pouring out more whatever you're going for, you want to have ideally really great fertile window in order to conceive well. So there's a lot of different factors at play. It's hard to kind of
mm,
simplify it all. However, yes, and then you could be like, okay, now it's luteal phase and I'm really trying to nurture this pregnancy. Yes, like if you've possibly conceived or you might conceive, you can absolutely be working with herbs to kind of help to support increase or support your progesterone if that's
mm.
something you had an issue with, or you can work with herbs to potentially just like nourish, like hardcore nourish the uterine lining and just your body essentially, because and I think reducing stress is huge in the luteal phase because your body is not going to want to keep a pregnancy. I mean, of course bodies are amazing and miraculous and they do all kinds
Mm,
of things, but from a survival perspective, from a like evolutionary perspective, your body's probably not going to feel like, oh, this is a great time to be pregnant if you're just under a state of acute or massive chronic stress, right? Or inflammation, for instance.
mm,
So yeah, that's a time when you could be like, oh, I'm gonna really bulk up on some of those herbs to support those things. So absolutely. And I will also say, depending on the person and depending on what they have going on, if they've got like if somebody has like say a shorter luteal phase
mhm,
and they're kind of really dealing with that and they know that because they've been tracking their cycle or they've had testing or something. I think tracking your cycle is probably, I mean, it's just so empowering to do it that way. But let's say that's what's happening and it's just not long enough really to sustain that pregnancy kind of really taking hold, then you might want to be working with certain herbs over the course of months. You're not going to be just taking them only in the luteal phase. So I just want to make
mm.
that clear too, is that it's person to person. It's not like you're gonna uh it depends on what is going on and how kind of chronic or challenging a
Yeah.
certain situation is.
I'm thinking as I'm talking to you now, I'm not going to ask you about specific herbs for every condition because I have a feeling that this should be like an inspirational interview that gets people motivated to contact an herbalist and see what works for them in their unique situation. And you probably wouldn't want listeners to go out on their own and sort of,
I
or
mean, it
would
depends
you?
on, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that I think plant medicine is people's medicine. I think
Hmm.
that everyone has capacity to work with plants on their own. It just takes a lot. I think one of the things that is also true and that really is common for me to get a question about is like, oh, what can I do for endometriosis?
Hmm.
That's an example of a question. And then it's like, okay, well, the truth is that everyone is an individual. We're not like, if we're actually working with herbs in a way that's going to be more effective,
Hmm.
we're going to be looking at the individual and we're not going to be looking at the condition. So yes, the condition may
Mm,
have certain components, but
mhm,
something like endometriosis has a lot of different presentations. It doesn't always look the same. It doesn't show up like it doesn't. Sometimes people have a ton of pain. Sometimes people have very little pain. Sometimes people know that there's, places in their bodies that the endometrial tissue has grown. Some people have no idea, but it's all over the place. So it's really individual.
mhm,
And there's a lot of different source points for where that might kind of be originating. So whereas, yes, it would probably be helpful for any of those people
mhm,
to be working on detox and elimination and reducing inflammation.
mhm,
Absolutely. So looking into herbs to support those things. But there's no magic bullet that's like, oh, this is what's going to help, because every person is going to be different. Some
yeah.
people, it's lifestyle. And honestly, like endo is one of those things that is complex, and it can be very complex because it
Mhm,
can be something that's like carried on generationally. It can be something that there's, certain environmental or lifestyle factors or history that has kind of caused certain things to happen.
mm,
So it might be a longer term kind of process. So it really depends, especially with chronic conditions like that, um, how a person wants to approach it. But yeah, no, I wouldn't say that people shouldn't go out and work with herbs. I think they absolutely can. And
mhm,
I encourage that. I do think it's important to know where your information is coming from. So if someone did have like if somebody does have like an actual chronic condition like that, I do think it's a great idea to work with like a clinician who really knows what they're talking about.
mm,
um, which
yeah.
is not always easy to discern who those people are.
Mm,
Uh, but I do think, because there's a lot of people out there who are like Instagram experts and may or may not have a lot of training or understanding of certain
mhm,
things. If you ever hear somebody being like this herb for that thing, it's likely that there's an oversimplification happening there,
mhm,
especially for a chronic condition like that.
yeah.
But yeah, I think it's great to work with an herbalist. And I think, getting some books that are helpful and just looking through them and trying to match your own personal constitution, your own symptoms to different herbal protocols is an option too,
Mm,
for sure.
mm. And one thing, so you just mentioned the third pillar. Was it smooth? Was it smooth and
Soften and moisten.
soften and
Mhm.
moisten, and nurturing that sort of receptive state within yourself? I feel that would apply to anyone who's trying to conceive. It also sounds like something that happens much more at a sort of an emotional or spiritual level than a physical level, or not? Is that how do you see plants working at all of those different levels next to just like the pure physical
Yeah,
effects?
it's both end, right? It's both end, because actually a lot of our tissues are tense and tight.
Mm,
And so softening those is physical, but there's also it's absolutely true that our nervous system, everything's so interconnected. And our nervous system often has a lot to do with why we're feeling tense, or why we're feeling hard, or why we're holding in a certain way,
mm,
why we're not receptive, we don't feel safe, like whatever, all the things that we might be experiencing. So from that lens, yes, I think there's a spiritual level, I think there's an emotional level, I think there's a mental level of that. And all of those play a role. So herbs are all of those things. That's a really cool part about working with plants, is that they're each individual beings, just like we are. We would
mm,
never go up to another person and be like, oh, hey, you female bodied person that is, 5'6" and 135 pounds and whatever. Like, that's, you're not gonna just think that's their entirety.
mm,
Just like, oh, this physical part. Every being, including plants, has many layers to it. And so plants, actually, what's so cool about them is that a lot of them do have affinities for multiple systems of the body, and they work in all these different ways. So for instance, let's talk about soften and moisten. Shatavari just keeps coming up. It just keeps like showing up in my brain. So shatavari, which is an Ayurvedic plant, it is, do you know it? Okay,
no,
so
no,
Shatavari, asparagus racemosa, I think it is the Latin name. It's an
mhm,
Ayurvedic plant, often worked with as a powder. So that, and as a powder, it could be in a tincture form or it could be in a powder form. absorbs best into the body with ghee or with oil or with fats, which is really interesting because when we think about, moistening and softening, there are certain herbs that actually absorb better with that quality involved in it. So when we start to get to know the herbs, it's not like, oh, I'm just going to take shatavari and then everything's better. No, it's like, okay, let's learn about this plant, learn about how to work with this plant. What does this plant even do in the body? How am I working with it? But yeah, so shatavari is, from an Ayurvedic perspective, really considered to be, gosh, what is it? I forget what there's a translation of it that's something like thousands of children or something like that. I can't remember what it is, but it's like the concept that taking shatavari will encourage abundant fertility, essentially, right? So like lots of babies. And it's not going to be true for everyone. That's the truth, because everybody is different in what's going on. But it is a plant that softens and moistens. So shatavari also is, I believe it's actually phytoestrogenic, meaning that there are constituents in shatavari that will bind to estrogen receptors in our body, which will encourage the estrogen response, right? So like if we have like a lower state of estrogen, if we're not having cervical mucus that's super like copious and that is egg whitey, or that's like, fluidy, if we are experiencing dryness of our skin or dryness of our vaginal tissues, it may be helpful for those things. It's also just an incredibly deeply nutritive and nourishing plant. So when you think about softening and moistening, yes, there's the estrogenic quality that actually is a soft, moist quality, right? And then there's the part of it's also nourishing our tissues can also help soften, because when we feel like we're nourished, we can relax a little bit more. It's interesting how that's also a piece. And then shatavari as a plant is anxiolytic, meaning it can reduce anxiety. It's a potential adaptogen, meaning that it can help us be more resilient to stressors in our life. If we have chronic stress in our life, even acute stress potentially, it can support our stress response. There's ways that, and so this is very scientific, and so I'm coming from that lens right now, but there's ways that all of that helps, right? All of that helps the softening and moistening process. All of that helps the cultivating receptivity. All of those pieces. And then if you think about from a spirit level, yes, like shatavari, when I think of the plant shatavari, I think of this soft, kind, loving, nurturing presence. So taking that physical herb into the body can bring that energy of soft, kind, nurturing, loving, and the physical components of everything that I shared about. So it's like when we look at herbs and we realize they're multidimensional beings like we are, that's how we can actually take them. And I think the more that we have awareness of that, the more we can actually receive some of those other qualities too. Because it's so like, it's easy to go to a store and be like, oh, I don't know what it's like in Europe, but like, it's easy to go to a store and be like, oh, I'm going to get a capsule of this thing and I'm just going to take it. It's very disconnected if we don't know anything about what that is. It still might have effect. It's not saying it's not going to have any effect.
Yeah.
But the more we can learn about the plant almost as if it's a plant person, like it's as if it's a being that we get to know like a friend, the more we can really allow our bodies to respond to and receive the multi-layered aspects of it.
It's basically like, I think the big shift that needs to happen for anyone who's trying to conceive, it's moving from that means to an end perspective to going to the process, being in the process of trying to conceive. So taking that capsule, it's just a means to an end. I want the effects of this plant, right? But being able to be with the plant, maybe sit with the plant in your garden, meditate, what do I feel? That's how your system, or it's how I would see it in any case. Like, that's how your system already starts to benefit without even having taken that plant itself, and really connecting to what am I feeling here. And it's difficult. I just started doing this course or 2 years ago, not just, Dutch shamanism, which is all about finding back the ancient religious roots that we used to have here in the Netherlands. And turns out that was all about trees. So my first response when I on the street now is to see trees and I want to Google them. See, okay, what's this tree? What does it
Mm.
signify? Going into my rational mind, wanting to learn the names. And I realized there's a different way. I can just sit with the tree, be with the tree, and feel what this tree does for me. Um, but that's not how we're used to learning or connecting to anything, right? And I think that's the real invitation of the fertility journey is to find that much more intuitive, receptive. It's a whole new way of relating, which is also the beauty, I think, of that whole journey.
Yeah, I actually that brings up a couple of different things, but I had a client last year who was on a fertility journey herself, and one of the homeworks I gave her was to just explore what feeling receptive could be like, because she tends to be the type of person who's very type A, make
Mm,
it happen. She has a lot of financial resources. She's typically able to just do what she wants to do, and get what she wants in a lot of ways, And I think when you're on in the fertility journey and things aren't happening, it can be extremely frustrating. I mean, it's so emotional for everybody, but for someone who tends more in that direction of like, I always kind of can make it happen,
mm.
for it
What
not
do
to
I
happen.
need to do? Yeah.
Yeah, can be so hard.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting because even when I remember I gave her like a protocol, we went through, a whole clinical session, then I gave her a protocol and she did everything. And I was just
Mm,
like, ooh, I almost feel like you're doing too much at
mm.
once, Let's
Yeah.
like let's like calm it down and let's just take some time to explore what it could feel like to receive. What does that look like for you? Just to completely release any of that energy of like need to do or all of that. And we talked about, she lives near the ocean and one of the ways that she found to do that, because I just wanted her to find that in her own life.
Mm,
She came back and she told me one of the ways she started doing that was just laying on the waves
mm.
and letting herself float there. I was like, that's so beautiful. And I never would have thought of that because I don't live, I wouldn't have done that. So it's just so cool to hear when people find their own way with it. But
Yeah.
just feeling that energy and just thinking, yeah, like that is part of this practice. It's the part of the way that we connect with nature. It's part of the way that we connect with the trees, like you're talking about. It's not necessarily about going and Googling and doing and knowing. It's often more about how do we receive
Hmm.
the wisdom, the medicine that's there for
Mm.
us.
Yeah.
But that brought that up. And then the other pieces that I had a mentorship session last week with someone who kind of newer to the journey, but she seemed really interested in a lot of the energetics and kind of spirit level of plants. And so I just encouraged her to like, yeah, to just see if she feels attracted to any plants around her. She doesn't know any plants, but just to
Hmm.
not go out with like an ID book or
Mm.
any of that.
Yeah.
Just there's maybe a plant that attracts her. And if she can just go over and sit with that plant and not know, but receive. Like she
Hmm.
could journal, it could be journaling, it could be drawing, whatever it is for her that shows up as some kind of receptive quality. It could be singing, it could be just being with. But I think there is so much. Yeah, one of the first ways that I learned about working with plants was actually doing that kind of practice, the plant
Mm.
ally practice, and just connecting with them. And I think that gave me a lot of sense of, oh, there's so many ways of knowing. And like you're saying with this like Dutch shamanism course and experience, it's like it's in our ancestral lineage to be able to know the
Hmm.
plants in that way.
Yeah. And then maybe the discomfort of trying something new, that's actually the sign that you're making process or progress. You're trying something new, you're stepping out of your comfort zone, you're
Yeah,
discovering a whole new way of being. Because the old way that wasn't working, right? Um, um, and for anyone who's experienced pregnancy loss, can herbs also help with that?
of course. Of course. Yeah. So if they're in the actual experience of like an active miscarriage, there's totally herbs that can support in that process. And then post miscarriage, I think of depending on if somebody, how far along they were when they lost
Mm,
their pregnancy. will kind of depend on what level of hormonal load they've had and what kind of drop happens. But it's essentially a mini postpartum period when someone loses a pregnancy. So there are so many herbs and so many ways that you can support yourself in that process. I would say if you're going to just be like, oh, there's just one herb to work with, which is not true. There are many,
Mhm.
many, many. Or a couple things. I would say, nourishing infusions, like I mentioned before, that kind of thing that like anyone is going to be supported by nourishing infusions, but especially adding in a lot more red raspberry leaf would be really lovely there. Making sure you've got the nettles, making sure maybe you've got the alfalfa to really build your blood. Especially if you had a lot of blood loss, it depends how far along you were or what happened, but that's an option. And then one of my beloved plants, motherwort,
Mm.
Leonoris cardiaca, such an amazing, wonderful ally, especially for that kind of hormonal drop period and then just kind of adjusting. So both because there's the capacity. Well, it's interesting because you're maybe going to talk about the womb heart connection. And I think about motherwort as a very strong herb for that womb heart connection. Because really what's happening when we lose a pregnancy, if assuming that that was something that was desired, is there's a huge, it's not just the physical transition, it's also the emotional, the grieving, the like
Mm.
all the all the stuff that can come up from an emotional layer and a spirit layer. There's so much, so many ways to support. It would be, I feel like I could write an entire book on how to support someone post miscarriage,
Mm.
but just from that lens of the womb heart connection, bridging those worlds, motherwort has a really lovely affinity for that, kind of calming and easing both the heart and the womb space. But also, motherwort has a little bit of a capacity to be antispasmodic, just kind of like tend to the womb a little bit. But is also a bitter, can help with like just moving excess hormones out of the body. There's just like so many ways. And then if there's anxiety, if there's different stuff coming up, just a really lovely, wonderful, when there's the mood swings happening, ally to
Mm.
have around in the form of a tincture, just as needed, could be lovely. Yeah, I feel like when we're talking, it's interesting because I feel like you were mentioning before, I wouldn't want somebody to just go out and use herbs. That's not true. I think when we're talking about acute situations like
Mhm.
post miscarriage, or we're talking about even for fertility, or even for some kind of common condition that comes up or if somebody just wants to work on their menstrual cramps or something, and they're not trying to look for this like longer term, big systemic support, you can work with herbs. Like I think it's
Mhm.
great to just go out and try things and see how they work. There's a lot of herbs that are helpful for that. But when you're looking at something that's more chronic, like the endometriosis, the PCOS, like
Mm.
infertility that's gone on for a really long time, and that's kind of like a big journey that maybe there's like certain, conditions that are known or unknown that
Mhm.
are there. Those are reasons that I would be like, oh, it's
Mm.
probably a good idea to work with a clinician because they're going to be able to really look at the larger perspective.
Yeah.
There's no like one herb to help. But
Yeah.
for, yeah, post miscarriage, there's so much. And then you could think, yeah, of course, we could even think towards the spirit level, connecting with the spirit babe, which I think is really, I think that's a really beautiful element to pay attention to, especially when there's been a loss of some kind,
Mhm.
or if there's a desire for conception,
Mhm.
that can be another place to work with. But you can absolutely work with herbs, not really from a physical level, obviously,
Mm.
but more from like that spirit emotional level to kind of connect, to really allow yourself to connect. And that could be in the form of a flower essence, which is more of like a kind of spirit medicine, or
Mhm.
that could be in the form of actually just drinking teas, but having more of that orientation towards kind of intuitive connecting. And yeah, or like creating sacred space. You can work with herbs
Mhm.
like you probably even know from your shamanism course, but we can work with herbs in so many ways. We can work with herbs to clear space out. You can work
Mhm.
with like artemisias and sages to like clear space, to really move energy. You can
Mhm.
create sacred space with roses. You can do so many things with herbs that aren't just taking them as tinctures or
Yeah.
yeah. There's so much. Gosh,
Yeah.
it's a whole
Yeah.
world. It's a whole world. I've been doing it for 20 years and I'm still learning.
And what would be good herbs if you want to connect to your spirit baby in that way?
Mm.
Like in a tea, for example. You mentioned the flower essences. But...
Yeah. I think it would depend on the person and what their needs are if it's bringing certain things up. But I guess the one that comes up for me, a couple that come up for me immediately are Tulsi and Rose, and probably a little bit of licorice if somebody doesn't have um, high blood pressure. Now, licorice can potentially raise blood pressure, so that's something to
Mm,
know. Um, but Tulsi, Rose, and it's funny because they're just simple herbs. A lot of people know these herbs, maybe drinking these herbs,
mm,
but when you really learn about these plants, you get to know their character. And when I think about Tulsi, which is also called holy basil,
mm,
um, I think about a plant that has an incredible, generous quality, that has a very uplifting energy, that also has a lot of spirit connection. It's considered to be this sacred plant for a reason. There's a way that it helps us to kind of connect, connect, um, presence, release, connect,
mm,
uplift. So I think Tulsi is really lovely, and it also tastes pretty good in a tea, depending. Most people like it. And then rose, just, oh my goodness. If there's, especially if there's grief, I think another rose is another one of those womb heart connections in my mind that
mm.
I think motherwort and rose both are, but I would never put motherwort into a tea unless somebody really likes to drink bitter, earthy taste things. But or you could put just a tiny bit, but not a lot. But the rose is also that kind of, it really connects the womb and the heart together. And so I think for the spirit babe element, bringing those in would be
Mm,
lovely. The licorice I would bring in partly as a softening and moistening herb. So partly from that lens of just also just sweetening it. I think
mm,
sometimes the sweetness can help us to feel a little more connected, a
mm,
little like more tended to, and so allow ourselves to connect a little bit more. But that softening quality for sure, and a little sweetness. And then if I'm also thinking about, well, what else might help with intuitive connection, I think about an herb like maybe gotu kola or bacopa, which are both Ayurvedic herbs, but those are also really helpful herbs for clearing the mind. They're often used for meditation. So I think any herbs that are helpful for things like meditation could be helpful potentially for like connecting with your spirit babe. So like really allowing that. They both of those herbs can be worked with in tea. Bacopa doesn't taste very good, but gotu kola is fine in tea. Um, there's a lot of different, yeah, there's a lot of different herbs, honestly, that could be
mm,
used in this way. I think another couple herbs that show up, just thinking about this, lavender is another
mm,
one, um, which can be, some people like the way it tastes in tea and some people do not.
mm,
But if somebody likes it, that could be a nice one that really is calming and easing, but also has this quality of uplifting connection. It kind of clears the head a little bit.
mm,
Yarrow is another one that can be used in that way. For some people, it's a protector. So if there's a feeling that, I think of yarrow as a protector herb.
mm,
So if there's a feeling that like there's a need for that from a ritual perspective,
mhm,
then yarrow can be worked with in that way. And that could be in the tea, or that could be kind of like placed around you, or that could be as a flower essence. There's a lot of ways to work with that.
mhm.
Um, and then the other one that comes up is rosemary. I feel like I could keep talking about herbs forever, but like the other one that comes up is
Yeah.
rosemary. And I think it's another one that is very much clearing, supporting. It's funny, there's all these herbs I just mentioned are like in all the brain and memory and focus teas. And I'm just like,
Mm,
no, but they're also the herbs that help. The reason that they're there is that they help to kind of clear our channel,
mm.
help us to connect, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
rosemary is another one. So that's some ideas.
Some things to use. Um, and thank you for making that sort of distinction between, okay, if you suffer from chronic conditions, then it might be good to find a practitioner, but definitely start working with herbs. So how would someone start incorporating them in their lives? You mentioned the infusion. So an infusion is just you put herbs in water and let it steep overnight, I think.
Yeah, like a nourishing infusion, there's only certain herbs you would want to do that with because they're really almost food-like herbs. And so herbs, like I mentioned before, which are like the nettles, the oat straw, the alfalfa, the red raspberry leaf, the red clover you can do that with.
Hmm.
You can do that, which is also softening and moistening, by the way. That's a nice softening and moistening herb. And you can mix these together. You could do that with hawthorn. Some people do that with linden. It can get for some people, that's a little bit too much.
Hmm.
Um, those are some examples. I'll leave it at that. There's other herbs too, but that's kind of the concept of these herbs that are very gentle on the
Hmm.
body and more nourishing and nutritive than they are like hardcore active, right? So those herbs you would take, you can mix them together depending on what you want. You could make a little blend, or you could just do one of them. And you take like literally a whole handful of them, which is essentially 30 grams ish of herb, which is a lot. And then you put that, or an ounce, depending on where you live and how you measure things. And then you put that into a jar, which could be like a liter or a quart jar. So a nice big jar, and you place that in, and then you pour just boiled water over, and then you cover that, and then you let that sit for 4 to 8 hours or overnight. And then you strain it and you drink it. And the idea is to drink that entire, that entire jar of tea that following day, so that you're really receiving that deep nourishing quality from the plants. It's very different from just having a beverage tea, right? Like this is more of like a mineral replenishment tea.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the way that I think many of us could be. It does mean that you have to have a lot of herb. It's not like that's not a small amount of herb. So buying in bulk or growing a lot of plants, or maybe
Mm.
you live around, big patches of nettles or something, that could be options. But it does for me in my experience, for instance, with nettles, I'll buy like 2 pounds of nettles. I don't know how many kilos that is, but like 2 pounds of nettles at a time, so that I
Mhm.
just have this huge stock that I can just pull from as needed. Um, yeah, so I'll put that out there. And then I think honestly, there are so many ways to work with herbs. So yeah, just drinking more herbs in tea, exploring that, exploring if there's any herbs that you feel like particularly drawn to kind of, yeah, to just see if they are supportive for you. If you want to start exploring extracts, there's many ways to work with them. You could do tinctures, you could do elixirs. Elixirs actually taste good because they have honey in them. So if somebody wants something that actually tastes good, that's nice. Rose elixirs are really lovely and they're uplifting and they're just supportive in general. Tulsi elixirs are really lovely. Um,
So that's
but yeah,
something you would
really,
make yourself as well, just water, herbs, and honey?
oh yeah, good
Yeah.
question. So an elixir is essentially a tincture mixed with, essentially, it's typically a tincture mixed with honey. So a tincture being an alcohol extract. And
Hmm.
so you might use brandy or vodka or some kind of alcohol. Typically for an elixir, you're not doing like a really high percentage alcohol. You're doing more of like something you might have in a cocktail or something. And so that sort of alcohol, and then you just put in usually like an aromatic plant of some kind. So it could be rose, it could be tulsi, it could be lavender, it could be any really aromatic, rosemary, it could be any aromatic plant. Kind of like, I don't know about rosemary. Chamomile is a good one.
Mm.
Anyway, so all of these are plants that are lovely in elixirs. And then what you can, and ginger is a nice elixir. And so you can just make a tincture with those. You make a tincture, meaning you just like put the herb in and then you cover it with the alcohol. You let it sit for 2 to 3 weeks covered in a dark place and shake it up regularly. And then you strain that. And then you've got your tincture. That's a very folk kind of basic tincture. There's a lot of other way. I make tinctures in a very different way from that typically, but I'm just going to give you this quick recipe.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to make the tincture. And then you can take that and you can warm up some honey, unless your honey is already pretty like fluid. You can warm up the honey a little bit and then you can just mix it in to taste until it actually tastes pretty good. There are other things that you can actually infuse herbs into your honey if you want
Hmm.
to. It's a different process, but you can do that and you can add those two together. You can do
But with the tincture,
yeah.
because so I'm thinking a lot of women are sort of staying off of alcohol when they're trying to conceive. So you would just do a couple of
Mm.
drops, or is it really like an alcoholic beverage?
It's not like an alcoholic beverage. So
No.
it's actually totally fine even throughout pregnancy. I will say I have studied pregnancy safety. I know a lot about this stuff.
Mm.
It's totally fine even throughout pregnancy to be working with tinctures because it's such a small amount of alcohol.
Hmm.
Everyone is different. Everyone's going to make their own choices. I would never say that somebody should just use it if they don't want to.
Hmm.
Please don't. But it's such a small amount. It's like an entire ounce. So an ounce, a tincture bottle, like a 1 ounce tincture bottle, which you might
Hmm.
find in a store, that would be like the equivalent to a shot, right?
Mm-hmm.
but you're typically just taking 1 milliliter out of that. And there's like 30 milliliters in an
Mm-hmm.
ounce-ish, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's so small that, and if you're adding honey to that, you're getting even less of that.
Mm.
So it's a very, very small amount of alcohol, almost like if you're like drinking kombucha or something. Like, I don't know if
Mm.
that, but it's like if
Yeah.
somebody,
Yeah.
want to do that, that's fine.
Yeah.
But it's a very small amount. So depending on the person, what they want to do. Another way, if somebody didn't want to do that and they just wanted to have a nice tasting aromatic way to have a plant that was in a bottle, glycerates is a way to do that. So working with glycerin, which you can buy glycerin and then you just infuse. Glycerin really works best with aromatic plants, meaning plants that have a nice scent to them.
Mm.
Lavender glycerite, tulsi glycerite, rose glycerite. Those are lovely. And so if somebody really wanted to stay away from alcohol, they could totally go in that
Mm.
direction. You make that the same way that you would make an alcohol tincture,
Mm.
just with glycerin. Sometimes people add some water. Just look it up if you're interested in doing that and just follow some directions. But yeah.
Mm. So we have the infusions, tinctures, elixirs,
Yeah, and then I guess
just sitting and meditating with plants. I heard you mention on your podcast, just put more herbs in your food as well.
yeah. Yeah. I
It's
mean,
so
any
funny though, because I was just remembering today, that's my rational mind. When I started cooking, I would often leave out the herbs because that would cost me more money. And I thought, what does an herb really add, right, to a dish? Turns
mm-hmm.
out that's why my food was always so crappy. So it's like it's the flavor in life that you bring.
It
Yeah.
so is. It's so true. Yeah. Adding really like even looking at your spice cabinet, even or wherever you have your spices,
Mm.
every single one of those herbs is likely medicinal. Every
Mm.
single one. Like I don't think there's a single herb that we have, except maybe cream of tartar or something, which like I don't even know how often people use that, but it's, you know, pretty much every herb is an aromatic herb that has some kind of medicinal compound. A lot of them are carminative, so they're helping us with gas and bloating. They're helping us to actually digest our food. A lot of them are antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory. So the more herbs that we use in our cooking, the more medicinal compounds we're getting regularly. And if you think about how ancestrally, thousands, even hundreds probably, but thousands of years ago, we would have interacted with so many wild plants. We didn't have all the plants bred in the way that they are now to be like bland and boring. We would be interacting with so many wild plants, and each of those plants has so many like constituents, all of these different things, and our bodies like respond to those. So the more that we have this diversity of essentially phytochemicals that come into our body, the more we're being supported over
Mm.
time. And it depends on the person. Some people, there's some spices that like react weird in them. So obviously listen to your body, but
Mm. Yeah.
yeah, just adding more herbs in. And I think even eating more herbs, like if you have nettles, if you have dandelion leaf, like those kinds of herbs, burdock root, you can eat those, and
Mm.
bringing those in more regularly is really lovely too.
Do you have a
Yeah.
favorite herb yourself?
I mean, it depends on the year. It changes all the time, but um, I would say the herb that I probably most commonly take in is Tulsi, holy basil.
Mm.
Um, Daily, pretty much daily, at least one tea a day of Tulsi. Right now I'm drinking a tea. Well, I'm also drinking coffee, but I have my tea here, so I have the double. The coffee is what I've mostly been drinking in this episode, and then this is my tea. But I made it this morning, and this has red raspberry, Tulsi, red raspberry from outside. I mean,
Mm.
like seed plants, Tulsi that I grew, um, Damiana, which definitely did not grow, but I love. Damiana has a little bit of Shazandra, which I also really love. Actually, didn't talk about that, but another one that I think is so supportive for so many of us. I love Shazandra so much. Um, Probably a little licorice, I'm sure. I think it has a little chamomile and some gotu kola. So
Mm.
that's this tea here.
Mm.
Um, I would say that nearly all of those plants are one of my favorites.
I had so many more questions prepared for you, but I see we're almost through our hour. I do want to round up with one final question. Well, two final questions, really. But so you've done you 20, or you have 20 years of experience working with the womb. Um, you have done all of these podcast interviews. What is your take on fertility issues and conditions like endometriosis, PCOS, tilted wombs? Is there a deeper layer of information that we're missing or that's continuously being communicated to us? Sounds like a leading question, but it's not. I'm just like beyond the scientific. I'm just really curious. What is your intuition about what's happening right now with all of these female or menstrual or hormonal conditions that we're seeing?
I honestly, yeah, I think, I guess it is my brain thinking this, but I think that I know that it's our body's way of telling us something. So any of those conditions is our body sharing that there's some kind of imbalance in our life, in the world, like whatever. We're responding. We are like, as people with wombs, we are extremely, and women and people with wombs, we are extremely responsive to our environment. We are extremely responsive to our ecology, to the stresses in the world, to the essentially societal expectations. There's all of this stuff that we are extremely responsive to. Our hormones are extremely responsive. Some of us seem to be more sensitive than others. It's just part of the way that it seems to be as humans.
Mm,
I think those that are a little more sensitive are just more impacted, and then imbalances happen. So, where is the source point of all of those things? I don't have an answer to that. I think that there's a lot of different source points. I think it depends on what layer you're looking at.
mhm,
And I think each of them, I mean, each of them do show up differently in people. So it's really depending on that particular person. But I do think that it's an indicator. We're like the canary in the coal mine,
mm,
essentially, right? The concept
mhm,
where we are, yeah, our bodies are basically like something's going on, and we're not gonna cooperate
mhm,
because there's something else we need to be paying attention to. And all, of course, that can be remedied. There are ways that we can work with our own bodies and the response and kind of support to bring them into more optimal condition. But I think we are fully in relationship with the earth. We are
mm,
fully in relationship with each other, with all beings. So I think in some ways it's like indicative of our disconnection, and it's indicative of our, it's sad. It's really sad to think about it, but it's like indicative of the state of the world
mm,
and of the planet. Um, yeah, yeah. And I think that that's, it's every one of us, like I said, every one of us is different. And I think there are some people who, for some reason, have like incredible resilience
mm.
in a
Yeah,
state of like complete like devastation and challenge, and they're like still popping out babies. Like I
yeah,
don't really understand it. And
yeah,
I don't, it could be like, oh, that's genetic or whatever. But you know what? It doesn't always make sense. It
yeah,
doesn't. And I think there's also some part of it that is a great mystery, and
yeah,
that it's okay to not know too.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that expression canary in a coal mine, it reminds me of an article I'm writing right now on sperm health. And it's
Mm,
actually
yeah.
something you see in men as well. So sperm
Hmm.
count has halved over the last 30 years.
Hmm.
There's also so many studies out there that show that men with lower sperm counts or lower sperm concentrations, they just die earlier as well, or they end up in hospital earlier, or
Hmm.
they end up in hospitals more often. And it isn't because of underlying conditions. That's what they can check for.
Hmm.
Or there are underlying conditions, that can, if you have diabetes, for example, that will also affect your sperm count. But it's more than that. It's like, yeah, your reproductive organs are telling you there's a bigger issue here, the way you're
Hmm.
looking after yourself. We
Yeah.
briefly touched on this chemicals as well, exposure to chemicals. Um, and it's not just affecting your reproduction, it's actually affecting your life. Yeah,
Hmm. Overall, all of our entire health. Yeah.
our entire health.
It's
Yeah.
it's really true. I actually am in this amazing 2-year clinical program with this herbalist named David Winston, who is probably one of the foremost herbal clinicians on the planet. Like I feel very grateful to be in this class, learning from him. But one of the things that he mentioned actually last night, we have weekly classes, and last night he said something about microplastics. and like really, really, really nanoparticle microplastics, like really small,
Mm.
is that like we've always known they're kind of everywhere, but now that they're being able to check for smaller and smaller microplastics, they're like in everything. So we were just
Mm.
like constantly, no matter what, in all of our stuff, like
Mm.
exposed to these environmental chemicals and toxins that our bodies had no relationship with, hundreds of years ago. So it's like, how do they navigate it? And I think it's not just that, but I think, yeah, I totally see that. And it's interesting for you to mention the sperm count piece, because I feel like with men, it takes longer for them to be like, we're more the canary in the coal mine. It's like for them to get to a place where their sperm is being affected, it's kind of like, oh, we're probably like not doing so great
Mm.
if we're
Yeah.
getting to that level.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
scary. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much for a beautiful conversation, for sharing all of your knowledge on herbs with us. As a final question, I want to ask you what your general message would be for anyone who's dealing with fertility issues and or pregnancy loss.
Hmm. Your womb is wise. Your womb is wise. There's always possibility. Your womb is like a place of magic, pleasure, potential, connection, ancestral wisdom. And and coming into like more and more relationship with just that quality of trust, that quality of possibility, that quality of connection, like no matter what, and that quality of great mystery
Mm.
in our bodies, like knowing that the great mystery like hangs out in our womb space,
Mm.
and that there's something deeper there, no matter what happens, just to come back to that over and over again. I think, I don't know if I was just going to offer a message. I think just like allowing more of us allowing ourselves to feel that, to feel the neutrality. This is like what we were talking about earlier before we got on here, like this like neutrality around the mystery.
Mm.
It just allows life to be more beautiful in some way, even when we're walking in the unknown. And I think it's a lot of times those are like the unknown journeys. And tend yourself, love yourself, like find the pathways to like live as well as you can while on whatever journey you're on.
Mm.
Mhm.
Thank you. Where can listeners find out more about you and your work?
Well, I got my podcast, Herbal Womb
Mm.
Wisdom, as you know. So if people are podcast listeners, I think that's a great place to start, just to like get to know me. And then if you get interested in me, I've got, my social media at Herbal Womb Wisdom. My website is herbalwomb.com. So if you want to check out the website, things that I'm offering, am I do one-on-one work, limited, but I do some one-on-one work, 3-month programs, they're 3 to 6 month programs with people. So if that's something people are interested in, if they have some more of those chronic conditions going on, that's the kind of thing that I love to work with, both clinically and from a coaching lens, kind of really bridging those worlds. And then I'm offering classes and courses locally. I don't know how many people are listening who are local,
Mm.
but locally, I'm offering some classes this summer if people are interested. And online, I'm going to be offering a natural contraception course sometime this year. It'll be an online course, and I've got other things coming up here and there. So just feel free to stay connected.
Great. I'll put all of your details in the show notes as well.
Okay.
So thank you so much for this interview. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in this week. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Instagram at thatfertilefeeling or email me at francoise@thatfertilefeeling.com. I always love to hear from you and always get back to you and hope to see you back next week. Bye bye.